you.
All right, and as Ava said, good morning, everyone. My name is Omar Gates, and I'm a climatologist with the Great Lakes Integrated Sciences and Assessments, or GLISA for short. And today I'll be giving basically a Climate 101, talking about climate change in the Great Lakes region, in which we'll be looking at trends for not only temperature, but also precipitation, and how those trends are leading to impacts in which, again, there are different sectors within the Great Lakes region being affected as a result of a changing climate. But before we get into all of that, I would like to first introduce you all to NOAA's Regional Integrated Sciences and Assessments, or NOAA RISA for short. For this group of teams, we are actually regional teams comprised of 11 different teams in which we help the nation prepare for and adapt to climate variability and change. From this diagram that you see on the right, with GLISA, or the Great Lakes RISA, we are actually supporting all 8 Great Lakes states. So that includes Minnesota all the way to New York, as well as the province of Ontario, Canada. And speaking a little bit more about GLISA, we're actually a collaboration between the University of Michigan and Michigan State University, except for that 1 week in the year when there's some football game going on. But otherwise, the rest of the weeks, we're working together in order to help people understand climate science, especially in the Great Lakes region. So with that, in terms of our approach, with GLISA, we don't only use physical sciences in terms of providing information to people, but we also integrate that with social sciences. And through integration, collaboration, extension with our partners throughout the region, we're able to provide services and products to them using information that is publicly available and already existing. With these products and services, we try to answer 3 important questions. Those questions are: what has happened in terms of the past and looking at observations? What could happen in the future by looking at projections and models? And then ultimately tying it all together, what impacts, especially within this changing climate. So now that I've given you a brief introduction to GLISA as well as the NOAA RISA program, let's talk about how we should frame climate change according to my colleagues and myself, climatologists at GLISA. So when it comes to climate change, we do understand that it happens at different scales. And of course, there are multiple ways of looking at it, whether it's at the global, regional, or local scales. As you go smaller and smaller in scale, we do understand that many of the impacts and many of the effects from climate change can be devastating and drastic in many places around the world. However, we know that as we get to smaller scales, especially the local scales, many of these impacts can be readily adapted to compared to the regional and global scales at this time. So with that, now let's jump into some of the trends that we've seen in temperature and precipitation throughout the Great Lakes region. Starting off with temperature, we're seeing that based upon observations from 1951 through 2020, temperatures have risen by 2.3 degrees Fahrenheit. In terms of the future, in which we're looking at mid-century, or 2040 through 2059, we're seeing those temperatures increase even greater by 3 to 6 degrees Fahrenheit by that time. And again, these are based upon model projections of dynamically downscaled models provided by the University of Wisconsin's Nelson's Institute. With that, in terms of the seasons, we understand that winters are warming the fastest, in which again, currently in terms of annual temperatures, we're seeing that the number increased by 2.3 degrees Fahrenheit. But for the winter, we're seeing greater increases, in which we're seeing a 3.9 degree Fahrenheit increase during the months of December to February, which is a climatological, what we define as climatological winters. From this, what are the consequences of such warming winters? Well, one consequence is the freestyle cycles. So when we define freestyle cycles, we're actually talking about when temperatures are dropping above or going above or below 32 degrees Fahrenheit. Why is that important? Well, 32 degrees Fahrenheit is actually the threshold in which water converts to ice, in which again, when water converts to ice, that is something that's important for many different types of ecological as well as different sectors within the Great Lakes region that are paying attention to that specific threshold. So overall, within the region, we're seeing that the number of freestyle cycles are decreasing region-wide. And in particular, for the Southeast Michigan region, we're seeing, again, where the circle is located, that we're seeing a small and moderate decrease in the amount of freestyle cycles. And again, that goes back to the warming winters. Another result of the warming winters is, again, a longer frost-free season. And when we define frost-free season, many people may have heard of growing season. They're synonymous in that type of way. So again, if you hear growing season or the frost-free season, they're basically one and the same. With this, based upon observations from 1951 to 2020, we've seen that the growing season has increased by 16 days. Now, by the future projections, according to the global climate models that we use, we're seeing that by end of century or by 2070 through 2099, the growing season increased by 35 to 54 days per year. Why is that? Well, going back to, again, that warming winters, we're seeing that many of these changes are due to an earlier last winter freeze. So with that, now that we talked about regular temperatures, let's talk about some of the extremes that we've seen throughout the region. From this map, if you can see, this actually shows the observed number of days per year over 9 degrees Fahrenheit. And again, this is based upon the time period of 1991 through 2020, or the past 30 years. From this, again, you're seeing many of the northern parts of the region showing not as much days over 90, but as you go further south, you're seeing some parts of Illinois as well as Indiana having greater amounts, almost 4 weeks to 5 weeks of days over 90 per year. So again, that's just the number of days, not consecutive, but just throughout the entire year. In terms of the Southeast Michigan, we're seeing again that 7 to 14 days or 1 week to 2 week span of days over 90. And again, it's based upon observations from that time period. In terms of projections, we're seeing that by mid-century, so again, 2040 to 2059, many of these days over 90 will increase most likely to 9 to 37 more days per year compared to what we're seeing today. In terms of really, really hot days or 100 degrees Fahrenheit, we're seeing a 3 to 19 more day increase per year. Now, again, this isn't to say that, oh, Sault Ste. Marie is going to see 37 more days per year. Not necessarily. It all depends upon the location that you're in and where you're at within the region, in which, again, as you saw in the previous graphic, some of the areas further north didn't have as many days, but as you went further south, many of those days did increase significantly. So with that, now that I've talked about temperature, let's go into what are the trends for precipitation. So according to observations from 1951 through 2020, total annual precipitation in the Great Lakes region has increased by 17%. And from the graphic on the right, you can see that this isn't really even across the entire region, especially in areas of northern Minnesota, northern Wisconsin, as well as the Upper Peninsula of Michigan. From this, you can see that again, with that, they're not showing as much increase compared to other parts of the region, but in particular for Southeast Michigan, we're seeing that compared to the region at 17%, Southeast Michigan has a 22% increase in total annual precipitation. And when we're talking about percent change, we're actually looking at comparing the observations from 51 to 2020 compared to the reference period that GLISA uses of 1951 through 1980. So with that, let's get into some of the extremes in terms of precipitation. So based upon observations, the heaviest 1% of heaviest precipitation events has increased by 24%. Why are these events so important? Well, much of the nuisance flooding and minor damages are more frequently reported during such events, in which, again, people may have their homes inundated, there may be flooding on the streets, and at times there can be ways in which there may be power outages, as some may have experienced this past weekend. So with that, how does that look on a regional scale visually? Well, again, with this graphic, we're showing basically the percent changes in those heaviest precipitation events based upon two different climate normal periods. This includes 1951 through 1980 as the first one versus 1991 through 2020. As you can see on the graphic, you're seeing a lot of red compared to blue. With that red, that actually signifies increases throughout those parts of the region, and the blue showing decreases. And as you can see in Southeast Michigan, again, we're seeing almost a 20 to 80% change increase in the amount of these storms happening throughout those two, in comparisons of those two time periods. So again, with this, these are just, again, based upon observations. So what about projections? Well, we're seeing for Southeast Michigan, or for the region itself, Great Lakes region, I should say, that by mid-century, so again, 2040 to 2059, precipitation of days greater than 1 inch are projected to be 0.4 to 1.5 days more compared to what we're seeing today. By end of century, or 2070 through 2099, we're seeing again that greater increase of 1.4 to 2.6 more days per year. So with this, now that I've talked about rainfall, let's look at another type of precipitation that may be of significance around this region, and that is snowfall. So with these, you're seeing two different graphics representing, again, two different periods. The first one being 1961 through 1990, and then the second one being 1981 through 2010. From these graphics, one of the main takeaways is that basically snowfall has increased in lake effect areas, especially in around Upper Peninsula of Michigan, in which we're seeing estimates around 96 to 150 inches change throughout those two time periods. In terms of as we go further south, of course, we're seeing much of the snowfall has either remained stable or has decreased throughout southern parts of the region. And again, going back to that warmer winters, we're seeing that much of the snow within the region has transitioned from snowfall into rain. And again, that can be different throughout different parts of the regions, but we have seen that more frequently in southern parts of the region. So now that I've talked about some of the trends, let's talk about some of the impacts that are involved with a changing climate. Now with this is just a brief overview of what different sectors and different things are impacted by a changing climate. And this isn't like a thorough end-all be-all list of details. So again, with this, just let's go ahead and get into some of these impacts. The first one being, going back to extreme precipitation, stormwater impacts. Now again, with stormwater impacts, they can affect many different parts of the region in different ways. And with this, the overall consensus or the overall takeaway is that much of the increased precipitation events, including intense flashy runoff, will be amplified from such extreme precipitation. For example, in the top left, this is actually a picture from the reserve lands of the Bad River Band of Lake Superior, Chippewa, in which they were basically inundated and flooded by an extreme rain event in 2016, which basically caused much of the infrastructure to be inundated, as well as flooding along the roads and destruction of the roads to the point where emergency crews couldn't come in at all in order to help them. And the only help that they were able to receive was by a helicopter, in which many people were lifted out of the reserve lands in order to receive hospital care. For the bottom right graphic, this is actually from Lake Ontario, in which the Army National Guard had to step in order to help different residents along the lake shore be able to sop up much of the water. And because again, during a spring 2017 event, there was a large storm that came in and basically caused the waters to basically flood much of the properties along the lakeshore front. So with that, that's just one aspect of how climate change is affecting different communities. But let's talk about the lakes themselves. One in particular that many people may be aware of are algal blooms. So again, with this, as you see in the top right, this is a picture of Lake Erie, in which we're looking at the 2014 event, in which, again, there was a major algal bloom outbreak. From this, one of the major impacts was that for the city of Toledo, they had to basically cut down or shut off their water completely, because much of that cyanogen bacteria and all of that was getting into the water, thus making it unsafe for people to actually drink. So what are the factors that contribute to algal blooms? Well, there are actually two main contributors. That includes, again, extreme storms, which cause more runoff from agriculture based upon manure and all the other types of things that are going into the agriculture and going into the ground. From that runoff, that actually is providing nutrients or more nutrient loading into the lake itself. Because of how shallow Lake Erie is, We know that for sure many of the lake temperatures are warmer compared to other lakes within the region. With those warmer waters, we're seeing that much of the stagnation in terms of dynamics. So if you have warmer waters and you have stagnation, you're going to, of course, have all of that nutrients be able to just sit in one area. If you have all those ingredients involved, those would contribute to algal blooms. And one consequence of algal blooms are dead zones. So, of course, with this 2014 event, this wasn't the only event that has occurred for algal blooms in Lake Erie. In 1970 and 1975, as well as 2001 and 2002, we've seen very different amounts of algal blooms throughout Lake Erie. And again, as say with the dead zones, this is actually one of the consequences of algal blooms, in which, again, they're taking that dissolved oxygen out of the water, thus keeping fish from being able to breathe and be able to have the necessary environment for this fish on the bottom right. That wasn't the case, in which it had a sustainable or a suitable condition to live. So with that, continuing on with the lakes, we're saying, how does climate change affect lake levels? In particular, whenever we're talking about lake levels, there are three specific categories we want to pay attention to. That is precipitation, evaporation, and runoff. From this, all three of these drivers dictate or influence the way in which the lakes have different lake levels, whether they're high or low. And of course, climate change does play a major factor into this. From the graphic on the right, this is actually showing you a depiction or artist's depiction of how that cycle goes, in which the yellow arrows show the evapotranspiration and evaporation. So again, water going into the atmosphere. And then for the blue arrows, that's actually water coming into the system through overland precipitation, over lake precipitation, as well as runoff. So again, with this whole entire cycle, there's many factors that contribute to how the lake levels will react based upon certain conditions. So again, that's all well and good, but how does that look in terms of the future? Well, we know that many of the future water levels will depend upon precipitation and evaporation. Now, again, this goes back to whether the year will be the year in the future, years in the future, I should say, would be having a lot of precipitation, or will there be more evaporation, meaning because of the higher temperatures, will more water be going into the atmosphere? From this, many models, or lake models, I should say, show that short-term variability does include high and low lake levels. So again, it's not saying that, oh, we're just going to see high lake levels throughout the rest of the century or low lake levels. It varies. And again, based upon the conditions, such as having more precipitation coming into the lake or more evaporation taking water out of the lake, it just depends upon what conditions are available. So with that in mind, what are some of the impacts that are associated with lake levels? Well, we know for sure boating and recreation is affected, which again, people want to have high lake levels in order to be able to go on the lake more often, of course, for their own recreation. And in terms of shipping and navigation, this is important because, again, they need more water in order to carry more load. For properties along the lake shore, this is very important in terms of saying, okay, if we have high lake levels one year and then the next consecutive years is just low lake levels, that transition can lead to more erosion, thus making some of the properties unusable or not as attractive to some homeowners or property owners. And of course, with the changing lake levels, they provide protection to fisheries and wetlands. And with, again, these fluctuations, this can affect what species and what fish are able to survive in such conditions. So ultimately, now that we talked about lake levels, let's talk about one more thing that many people may have not considered in terms of the lakes, and that includes lake ice. From this graphic provided by the Great Lakes Environmental Research Lab, this is actually a measurement or a figure showing the annual maximum ice coverage from 1973 to 2020. Based upon this, again, this is just showing you that entire variability in which we're seeing the highs and lows of the different amounts of lake ice. In terms of recent lake ice coverage, we see that in 2020, we only had approximately 20% ice coverage. compared to the long-term mean of 53%, that's fairly low. Now with this, again, in 2019, we did have a high amount in which we're looking at 81%, approximately 81%. But again, as you see, it varies based upon which year, and it varies based upon the conditions that are available. So again, even with climate change, we will still see high amounts and low amounts in the future. And of course, what is the significance of lake ice? Well, we do understand that for ice, it actually provides protection for whitefish spawning areas. Why is this important? Well, much of the commercial fishing within the Great Lakes region itself is dependent upon this, with it being, again, a $4 billion industry. In terms of coastal zones, it provides stable platform for ice fishing for recreation purposes, as well as protecting wetlands from erosion. And in terms of water levels and navigation, heavy ice cover can reduce evaporation and contribute to higher lake levels in the following seasons, which is good news for shipping. And speaking of shipping, why is that so important in which we have those high lake levels? Well, for every inch of water that's lost in depth, we see that based upon studies from the past, much of the cargo is reduced by 50 to 270 tons. In terms of money, that actually costs around 10 to 30,000 per transit. So again, many ships are wanting higher lake levels because that will be good for them, be able to carry more cargo. But with that, if there is less lake ice, that does allow for a longer shipping season. So there are some trade-offs between both having more lake ice, in which we'll see more water in the following seasons, versus less lake ice, but in which we can possibly see more of a longer shipping season. So that's just one thing. So again, with this is just overview of what happens to the lakes, but I'm pretty sure with the Audubon Society, there is more focus on, again, plants and wildlife. So with this, we're seeing that based upon the studies that climate change, or based upon studies of different aspects, whether it's forest or biodiversity, much of this has been changing due to climate change. In terms of forest ecosystems, many of them are being forced northward, and this includes maple, beech, and birch forests being displaced throughout the Great Lakes region. Now, again, it's not like they can just grow legs and just simply walk up further north. No, that's not the case. In many cases, it's the seedlings that go further north, and in which case, much of the trees that are stagnant or staying in place eventually die off because of changing conditions. From this, in terms of another aspect of climate change affecting wildlife, we're seeing that there are amplified stresses on biodiversity. For example, many of the cold water fish rely on cold waters in order to be able to sustain themselves, and that in the consequence that we have warmer waters, we're seeing much of those species go further north. With those species going further north, there are other obstacles to consider, whether they're man-made because of dams or other types of things that are keeping these populations from freely going northward. And that's something that is a cause of concern for many biologists and ecologists around this area. And going back to agriculture, we know that, again, this is just another aspect of climate change in which, going back to the previous slides that I mentioned, we do have a longer growing season. However, with that, because of water availability, warm spells, and other types of factors, this may negate many of the benefits of a longer growing season because, again, with the changing climate, many of the crops and many of the other fruits and vegetables may not be able to sustain themselves with such changing conditions. So again, it brings me to the end of my talk. And again, with this, I'm opening up for questions and discussion for this part of the whole entire presentation. But if you are more interested in learning more about climate change in the Great Lakes region, please feel free to visit us at glisa.umich.edu, as well as email us at glisa-info@umich.edu. And I would like to thank you all for your time and consideration. And are there any questions?
Wonderful. Thank you so much. I have a couple questions that were sent to me. And for everyone else, if you have any questions, feel free to put them in the chat and then I can read them off, or just any discussion questions. We have a little bit of time. So the first question I have is, are there any specific negative impacts from the loss of the freeze-thaw cycle? Or is that kind of like yet to be seen? We're still learning.
So the science is still out, but in terms of the trends or the consequences of freestyle cycles, one thing in particular is, again, going back to agriculture, because with that one, I believe in 2012, there was a specific event in which the cherry crops were actually affected by a sudden freeze. And again, to give you a little bit more backstory, there was at a time warmer than normal temperatures, in which again the flowers and the crop itself just started to bloom way before it usually does. And then a severe event, a severe snowstorm came in and basically froze the crop, in which again many of the producers lost a lot of yield due to that one event. So with freestyle cycles, that's one of the things in which we're looking at in terms of understanding how does those changing winter temperatures affect different things. Another aspect is also in terms of infrastructure, because again, when you have these freeze-thaw cycles, these can affect the roads, in which again, many of us have driven on, in which again, we're seeing many potholes and many different things happening, because when you have warmer temperatures, you have the water go into different parts of the pavement, but then when it freezes, it starts to expand. So that's where we get all those types of effects from potholes and other types of things affecting infrastructure, for example. But again, of course, there are other studies that are going on as of right now in order to show how freestyle cycles are affecting the Great Lakes region. Thank you for the question.
Thank you. Okay, this is another question. Actually, this is one of my personal questions. I'm not sure if you know the answer, but when those houses get super flooded, are those houses able to be saved, or does the water damage, does the house have to be torn down after that? Like I see that out at St. Clair Flats where we do the black tern research, and I'm wondering about that. I don't know if you have the answer to that.
Not 100% sure, but again, I think for most of those, it depends upon the case. And if like a place is fully inundated, I'm pretty sure there are steps in order to like get the water out of the facility, and then try to see, based upon the damage, whether it's for cause of concern for mildew or mold. There are ways in which, again, they try to like basically see if it's salvageable or not. But again, I don't have much expertise in terms of like what is threshold or what are specifications for that. But again, hopefully I was able to answer your question.
What do you know some of the specific types of cold water fish, and are those cold water fish in lakes or oceans or both?
So that's most likely in lakes. So like when I was mentioning the cold water fish, I was most likely looking at, I believe, salmon as one, but again, I could be wrong. Can't think of it off the top of my head right now. But for most part, when I was mentioning the cold water fish, we're seeing much of those within the Great Lakes region itself. So
Okay.
with that information, I'm not sure about like ocean types and all of that, but for like just from the studies that we've seen, many of the cold water fish are affected, in which they're trying to migrate north, but again, they have obstacles in the way which are keeping them from being able to do that freely.
Yeah, yep, that makes sense. And then another question that just came up. How future drought across the US will impact the usage and availability of water in the Great Lakes?
And I think that's like one topic that has been going around, I guess, the community, the science community, in terms of like with the Great Lakes, of course, we provide a lot of fresh water to many municipalities in different areas within the Great Lakes region. So in comparison to places in the Southwest, we're doing pretty well, especially in terms of like water availability. And again, with that, even though there have been studies about, oh, what will we get our fresh water from. For the Great Lakes, we're pretty much in a good place right now. With that, there is a tangent to that in which we're seeing climate migration, where people from different parts are going from, say, Southwest all the way to the Great Lakes region in order to like escape some of the, I guess, what is it, the impacts or the most drastic impacts from climate change, whether it's droughts or whether it is different types of impacts. So again, it just varies, but at the end of the day, we have seen people be able to migrate to the Great Lakes region in order to like escape some of those more hazardous impacts, if that makes sense.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Another question. I am a Florida resident and the red tide has caused horrific fish kills. Did Lake Erie algal bloom cause fish kills, and how can we reduce use of fertilizers, which are a major cause?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a good question. And yes, within those different outbreaks, whether it was in 1970 or the 2014 event, many fish did die off because, again, with the cyanogen bacteria, we know for sure they were taking the dissolved oxygen out of that water. And with that, the fish need that in order to survive within the waters. And without that, they will basically die off. In terms of how do we reduce fertilizers and all of that, it may be going towards more of a holistic approach in terms of holistic agriculture. I'm not sure if that's like the proper term for it, in which again, you're taking what you need from the environment, but also giving back to the environment. And this is something that has been used by tribes within throughout many generations. And of course, many people within, I guess, our society are looking at ways in which we're trying to figure out how to be more holistic in terms of the environment and not using fertilizers in order to just simply say, oh, I just want to grow something, more along the lines of, okay, I'm going to grow what I need, but at the same time, give back to the environment as well.
Yeah, that makes sense. Another question regarding what you said. Who do we contact or write to request holistic agriculture?
Yeah, that's a really good question because again, it can be different types, whether you're looking at the state or federal level. Most likely, if you want to look at the federal level, you're looking at the United States Department of Agriculture or USDA. In terms of like environmental around Michigan, I know for sure you can check for Eagle, I believe that's their new name as of now, in which they're like the Department of Environment here. But yeah, they will most likely be able to be the ones to help you with like understanding what are some of their approaches as well as what are some of the, I guess, rules and regulations that are around holistic gardening and agriculture as well.
And you could possibly also visit local farmers markets and support some of the small scale farmers who
Exactly.
I'm sure have far less impact using much less aggressive fertilizers and stuff like that.
Yep, and just understanding where your food comes from is another thing to consider as well.
Yeah, for sure. Is Eagle a Michigan organization?
I believe so. It's EGLE. That's what it's spelled.
Okay. Yeah, I've heard of them before. Okay.
Yeah.
Does anyone have any other questions before we kind of wrap things up? Okay. Well, thank you everyone so much for attending the webinar. We appreciate you joining us. And if you enjoy the Detroit Audubon webinars and field trips, please consider becoming a member. Members receive advance notice about upcoming field trips, and you also receive quarterly issues of our Flyway magazine. Thank you so much, Omar, for coming and presenting to us. We really appreciate it. It was really cool to hear everything you had to say and how much everything reminds me of the climate impacts we are seeing on the black terns that we study out in St. Clair Flats. All of that really ties into their survival. So I think we're all good. Thank you so much, everyone. Thank you, Omar, and everybody have a good day.
Thank you again for your time.
Thank you. Bye-bye.